I'll probably talk a little bit more than just biophilic design. That will certainly be an integral part of my discussion, but forgive me, I do work for an environmental foundation, so I might just touch on the environmental benefits of timber, and particularly in circular design throughout the discussion as well. And very much looking forward to a Q&A on that afterwards. Thank you for that, the presentation, Tim. That was very insightful. I learned a very great deal from that, so thank you so much. As I mentioned, I'm from Planet Ark. We're an environmental foundation established in 1992. The tagline, if you like, is positive environmental actions for everybody, whether you're as individuals, schools, councils, organisations. It's really, and the real emphasis is on positivity. It's more about what we can do, not what we shouldn't do. The lovely photograph behind me is of National Tree Day, which has now been going for 25 years. And in that time, about 26 million native trees and shrubs have been planted by about 5 million Australians. Some of you might recognise Howard Parry Husbands. He's one of our directors. As you can see, he's having a lot of fun at National Tree Day. And part of the message of National Tree Day is actually the benefit that we get, both physiologically and psychologically, from spending time in nature. Research shows quite conclusively that just 10 minutes a day, ideally in parkland or woodland or wherever you might be, but gardens, but basically just being outdoors can have a significant benefit. And we'll touch on biophilic design and how to incorporate those sorts of techniques in the built environment. So we have a number of programs that you can see. I touched on National Tree Day. One of the more recent innovations was the Australian Circular Economy Hub, which was launched in November 2020 by the then Environmental Minister Susan Ley. And I'll touch on circular design through the course of the presentation. I won't dwell on all of that, but you can certainly find out more about those programs from the Planet Ark website. And as Jason kindly mentioned, I manage the Make It Wood campaign, which aims to increase the use of responsibly sourced wood as a building material. But importantly, what we want to do is provide trusted, credible, research-based advocacy for the timber industry and obviously wood products industry. So we're here certainly to help, and because we strongly believe, and before the campaign commenced in 2011, Planet Ark did a long period of due diligence, of research, looking at the timber and wood products industry, because ultimately Planet Ark's major asset, if you like, is brand. So clearly we're going to be very careful about doing things that might adversely impact that brand. And clearly, through the research, we found that obviously the timber and timber products have a significant benefit, potentially, both from an environmental as well as a health and well-being perspective. And so the campaign was, as you can see, launched in October 2011. And I've had the great pleasure of being a participant since January 2016. So one of the big opportunities, and it is a huge opportunity, and I'm sure it's been alluded to before, is the built environment. Building and construction, whether we like it or not, the cold hard facts are that by some significant margin, it has the most significant adverse impact on climate change. As you can see, and these figures you may see vary from one research to another, but they're broadly consistent. About 42% of total energy consumption, about 39% of CO2 emissions into the atmosphere, about 50% of extracted materials, and about 30% of water consumption. Just to give you a comparison, the airline industry, and here I'm talking about pre-COVID pandemic, so up to about 2019, when the airline industry was working at, if you like, full throttle, about 3.5% to 4% of total CO2 emissions. So the building and construction sector is of the order of 10 times the airline sector. So the corollary to that, of course, is that because it's a big emitter, a relatively small improvement in the environmental impact of the building construction sector can have a massive impact overall. So all of us here, presumably the fact that we're here, we've got a part to play in this. So building and construction definitely has a significant part to play, positively, I believe, in the amelioration of climate change impacts. Now, I want to just touch briefly on forestry in Australia, because it's sometimes, I think, unfairly denigrated. If you read the Australia's State of the Forest report, it's published every 5 years by ABARES, and the last one was in 2018. So we'll be looking forward to seeing an update of this next year. But in the last report, the total forested area in Australia is about 134 million hectares. It's about 17% of the land mass. And of that, at that time, about 2 million hectares, about 1.5% of the total was plantation. Now, as has been alluded to, sadly, since that time, that figure would have dropped, not least because of the bushfires and so on. But regrettably, in my opinion anyway, the store of plantation is declining. And as has been alluded to in the last hour's discussion, if we can find ways to increase that, then I think we all will be the better for it. But importantly, the plantation estate is responsible for about 87% of total timber production. So a significant majority of the local production comes from about 1.5% of total forest area. And of the remaining 132 million hectares of native forest, only about 5 million, so about 3.7%, is actually available legally for harvest in any 1 year. There are vast tracts, in fact, the vast majority of native forest in Australia, it's not possible to log, it's highly illegal to log. Hasn't been legal to log in rainforest areas since the 90s, for example. So whilst we occasionally hear from green lobbyists and so on that we're ransacking the country and burning all of our forests down or hacking them down, the numbers just don't support that argument. The vast majority of timber production, as I mentioned, comes from plantation, and the native forest production comes from a relatively small part, and we'll touch on certification later. And of that, almost all of it comes from certified forest and plantations. And certainly up to 2018, about 78,000 hectares of native forest would be harvested on an annual basis, which is extremely small comparatively. And I just want to touch on plantation. Again, this was part of the discussion earlier. And indeed, it started in the 1960s, largely government instigated, as part of a government investment in nation buildings. Now, the important thing here is that plantations were never, ever intended to replace native forest, but to complement them, so that they work side by side. They basically do things differently. And the native forestry sector, certainly in the vast majority of applications, is predicated on growing timber for the highest possible economic return. Makes good sense, and an economist like Tim would entirely understand that. And we know that many native species, Tassie oak or blackbutt or spotted gum, they typically can't be grown in monoculture plantation type environments. And when they are grown, they're typically used in high-value architectural and furniture-type applications, and maintaining that maximum economic benefit. In fact, some people say, well, why would you hack a tree down and just use it for pulp and paper? Well, there's about 1 million hectares of hardwood that is dedicated to that. Very little forestry of timber harvested in native forests would actually go into these applications. They're mostly used in high-value, high economic return applications. So I just think it's really important that we sort of don't necessarily sort of denigrate ourselves unnecessarily, because the forestry sector in Australia is one of the most highly regulated and most highly regarded in the world. And we ought to be proud of that. So that's getting off that little soapbox. There's essentially 3 environmental benefits that wood provides. The first, of course, is that it's renewable. You can't grow concrete, you can't grow steel, but you can grow timber. And we talk about at Planet Ark this concept of ecological footprinting, living on nature's interest, not its capital. Now, an average Aussie timber frame and truss home, if you like, it consumes about 12 cubic meters of timber. Sure, there'll be some bigger than that, some smaller than that, but on average, about 12 cubic meters. And research shows that we can, in the existing plantation stock, which is a little under 1 million square meters of predominantly radiata pine, that the timber for that home, for an average Aussie timber home, will be regrown in about 2.5 minutes. And that's this whole notion of ecological footprinting, so that when we obviously harvest for that, the next one is well on the way to being regrown. I'm not here to denigrate concrete and steel. They have their place, but you can't do that with them. The second major environmental benefit, and Tim alluded to it quite nicely, is that wood stores carbon. We all know from our high school biology the notion of the process of photosynthesis. Trees obviously sequester or absorb carbon dioxide through their growth phase, and emit oxygen, which is obviously, the oxygen's good for us as humans because that's what we breathe in predominantly, and the reduction of CO2 is good obviously for climate change because that CO2 has been absorbed rather than going into the atmosphere. And that creates what's called biogenic carbon. About 50% of the dry weight of timber is carbon, so-called biogenic carbon. And as has been mentioned, that then stays in the timber for as long as the timber exists. And furthermore, research shows quite conclusively is that if the timber, and it hopefully will be relatively few occasions, if the timber goes into landfill, that carbon is still stored. Because we've seen applications where timber has been buried for, say, 30 years, and it's still intact. So the carbon is still stored in that timber. It hasn't gone into the atmosphere. Essentially, the only way that it can go into the atmosphere if it's either burned or degrades. So as I say, about 50% of the dry weight of timber is carbon, and that's consistent across all species. Obviously, timber has different species and different densities and so on, and that 50% figure is broadly consistent. So as we mentioned earlier, an average timber frame and truss home will consume about 12 cubic meters of timber. Well, that's equivalent to 2.8 tons of biogenic carbon, which is stored in every home. And about 90% of the homes, certainly along the eastern seaboard of Australia, are made from frame and truss. So 90% of those homes, or each of those homes, is storing about 2.8 tons of this what we call biogenic carbon. And that equates to about 10 tons of CO2 per home, which has been taken from the atmosphere through the growth phase, through that process of sequestration. And we know that because basic chemistry, the ratio atomic mass of CO2 to carbon is 44/12. So you do the maths, and that's why we know that how much A, carbon is stored, and B, CO2 has been sequestered. So timber has a very great part to play, particularly in Australia, where the use of timber in home construction is so prevalent in mitigating climate change. And we certainly want to be doing that more and as much as we possibly can. And there are some examples around the world where timber has been storing carbon for a very, very long time. This is one of a group of about a dozen churches in Norway called the Ørnestav Church. And that was built along with 11 or 12 others in about 1130. So it's been storing carbon for the better part of 900 years. So anybody that tells you timber building won't last very long, well, have a look at this. And many, many, many other examples of buildings, particularly throughout Europe and Japan, where timber has been shown to be extremely long-lived. And the third environmental benefit, and I would argue possibly the most important, and this is only in my personal perspective, doesn't necessarily speak for Planet Ark or anybody else, is that wood has what we call very low embodied carbon compared to high, more carbon-intensive materials like concrete and steel. Embodied carbon is essentially all of the energy that goes into the manufacture of a product, from raw material extraction, transportation, life in use, end-of-life disposal, add all of that energy together, and that's what we call the embodied carbon inherent in a building product. Now, obviously, there is some energy that goes into the production of timber, sawing and milling and so on, but that's a relatively small, very small compared to concrete and steel. And just to give you some idea, concrete and steel each have a total impact on climate change, or in terms of CO2 emitted, of about 7 to 8%. Now, if each of them, concrete or steel, was a country, it would be the third largest emitter in the world behind the US and China. Now, mercifully, timber doesn't have that to worry about. So where applicable, and we're starting to see an increasing diversity of opportunities and applications, timber can have a great part to play in the amelioration of climate change. And as you can see, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, they did a study and a report which was published last December, where they showed that the use of timber in commercial or multi-residential buildings, larger applications, can reduce embodied carbon by up to 75%. So we're not talking a small incremental increase. We're talking, a significant potential increase in the way that we can reduce this, what we call the embodied carbon inherent within buildings. And as I say, I think it has a very great part to play in the future as we start to think, how can the building and construction sector help to ameliorate and minimize the impacts of climate change. Now, the only real way to understand exactly how much embodied carbon has been reduced is to conduct a life cycle analysis. Now, they can be quite time consuming and costly to produce, so they're not done for all buildings. But I do have the LCA that Lend-Lease did for one of the very first timber, in fact, the first timber office building in Australia. It's called International House in Barangaroo in Sydney. Was completed in 2016. And the LCA, and it's well over 100 pages, so it's a fairly meaty tome, if you like, shows quite conclusive that the global warming potential, in other words, the impact on climate change, is reduced by about 56%, largely because of the substitution of concrete and steel in the structure for engineered timber elements like glulam and CLT. So again, you can see that it's not just sort of maybe 5 or 10%, it is a very significant incremental increase. And you can see the graph on the right, that's from a UN Environmental Global Status Report in 2017. And there you can see that the environmental impact, or the CO2 impact of buildings, is about 28% is operational carbon, the energy that goes into the powering of air conditioning, lighting, ventilation, heating, etc. And a further 11% is attributable to the actual materials from which the building is constructed. Now, what's basically happening is the buildings are becoming much more energy efficient. We're using a lot more solar power to power them. So what's actually happening is the relativity of embodied carbon impacts is growing quite significantly relative to operational carbon. So, as I say, I personally think that is one of the biggest issues that we can look at, and a very great opportunity, I think, for using timber, again, where applicable, to minimize the impacts of climate change. And finally, wood can be, and in Australia is, sourced responsibly. By that, we basically mean certified. As I'm sure you're aware, there are two major certification bodies, both around the world and here in Australia, FSC and PEFC, which I'm sure Jason will tell you is known as responsible wood here in Australia. And of course, the two major benefits of that are, one, that certification ensures that the wood comes from legally harvested and well-managed forests and plantations. And most importantly, it ensures that when a tree is harvested, another one, and often more than one, is planted in its place, and thereby retaining what we call the carbon cycle. Because I was mentioning in discussions earlier, one of the issues, and people will say, well, chopping a tree down has to be bad because it has to be bad. Well, trees are a bit like us. They are born, they're planted, they have an early growth phase and a maturity phase, and a bit like me and Tim, eventually they get old and sadly eventually die. They don't sequester carbon at the same rate through their life. They will sequester it much faster at the beginning of their life, and just like us humans, they'll become less efficient, and that will taper off toward the end of their life. So in many ways, the best thing we can do, particularly from a climate change mitigation perspective, is to harvest the trees, replant them, and get that carbon cycle operating as efficiently as we possibly can. So it is not universally the case, a bad thing to harvest trees, and particularly if they're going to be used in long-lived applications like buildings, because as we mentioned, that's renewable, it stores carbon, low embodied energy, what's not to like? So that's the bit about the environmental impact of buildings. I'll just take a little sip of water, if I may, and then we'll talk a little bit about circularity. And as you can see on the slide, hopefully you've managed to read it by now, globally we use more than 100 billion tons of raw materials every year. That's about 13.3 tons per person. And whilst I don't know the figures, so don't ask me what they are, that figure is undoubtedly significantly higher in Western cultures like Australia, New Zealand, the UK and Europe and America than it would be in other parts of the world. So I think it's fair to say that that figure, particularly here in Australia, would actually be a lot higher on a per person basis. And very sadly, research shows that of that, about 8.6% is reused. And sadly, that figure is actually declining. Research prior to that showed that the figure was 9.1%. And the rest is, very sadly, effectively wasted. Now, one of the best descriptions I've ever heard of what circularity is it's mankind's attempt to model the cycles of nature. Because, of course, nature is 100% circular. As things die and then will be regrown and so on. So nature is 100% circular. We're 8.6. So we've got a lot of improvement to make, haven't we? And just to give you an example, every Australian is responsible, on average, for about 2.7 tons of waste per annum. Now, I don't know whether that's growing or declining, so but nonetheless, as a static figure, again, it's a fairly alarming statistic, and one that we obviously need to try and modify as best we can. Now, there are basically three principles of the circular economy, and if you've looked at this in any detail, you'd doubtless be familiar with the butterfly diagram on the right-hand side, which comes from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And the three principles basically are to design out waste and pollution, keep products and materials in use, and regenerate natural systems. And again, I don't really have the time to go into this in more detail because I want to get onto the health and well-being aspects. And certainly if you're interested in this, the ACE Hub website is a great vehicle for, there's some case studies and a lot of additional understanding and knowledge on this. So I commend that to you. But essentially, one of the way it posits it is that they split materials into what was called technical nutrients and biological nutrients. And you can see technical nutrients are generally sourced from finite resources that are extracted from the earth. For example, metal ores to make steel or oil to make plastics. And the whole theory posits that these must be maintained as long as we possibly can to reduce impact on finite resources. Now, the steel industry will tell you a lot of steel is recycled, and that's true. A lot of it's recycled. But as I mentioned earlier, you can't grow steel, and furthermore, recycling steel consumes a lot of energy because you've got to put it through the process of blast furnaces and so on. So yeah, it's great to maintain those resources, but it comes at a cost because those recycling processes are inherently energy intensive. Conversely, timber is one of a group of what we call, and the sort of jargon is this whole notion of a biological nutrient, which are generally sourced from renewable resources such as plants or algae. algae. And timber, of course, it's a natural material. It is a biological nutrient and follows what we call the biological or the carbon cycle. So from that, timber has if you like, a natural advantage. It is inherently circular because of that. And obviously we need to find ways, and we touched on this, when buildings are complete, what can we do to make sure we're retaining that timber? And I think one of the benefits, particularly with the advent and the use of mass timber elements here in Australia and around the world, is that many of those buildings are they're manufactured in a factory, are designed for manufacture and assembly. So they're produced to very high tolerances in a factory, installed on site in a very regimented process, a bit like a glorified IKEA. Now that a takeout of that is that they go through a process of manufacture and assembly on site. There's no reason at all why that process can't be reversed at end of life and then find ways to redeploy those. Now, here in Australia at least, it's too early to actually see working examples of that. The very first mass timber building in Australia was Forte, which was completed in 2012. So it's only 10 years old. So we're still in the relative infancy of those types of techniques here in Australia. But nonetheless, the technology exists to look at, okay, and designers certainly ought to be thinking, how do we manufacture it as quickly and efficiently on site? And Tim alluded to that earlier. But also as that, once the building comes to the end of its design life, what can we do to make sure it is as easy and straightforward to be able to disassemble the building and then redeploy those highly valuable components which are more than capable of providing value in a new building or new application. Now, Amsterdam is an absolute leader in the circular economy principles. They've been working on it for some years now. And as I mentioned earlier, globally, mankind is about 8.6% circular. Amsterdam's about 24%. So 3 times the global average. And this didn't happen by accident. They've had a lot of processes, and it includes the built environment as well as many other applications. So it shows what can be achieved with technical experts and a high level of focus. So Amsterdam, Finland, places in Northern Europe, they're certainly, and the great benefit of that, we can learn from that. We just had a visitor, Professor Jacqueline Kramer from Holland, has been with us in Australia for about 2 months. So she's had more than one discussion per day on average over a process of a time of 2 months. So we're learning quickly, and obviously Amsterdam is a great vehicle for that. So that's just touching on circularity, and as I mentioned, if you have an interest in that, I sort of recommend what was called the ACE Hub website, where there's a lot more case studies and information for you. Now, I just wanted to divert a little bit to talk more specifically about health and well-being, and the benefits that come particularly from the use of natural materials like timber. And to that end, it doesn't feel like it, but we wrote a report back in 2017. It was released on World Wood Day, the 21st of March, 2017, so a little over 5 years ago, which astonishes me. And it outlines the benefits of connecting buildings with the natural world, and shows a clear empirical benefit, a beneficial effect on our physiological and psychological well-being. And that report is available for download as a PDF on the Make It Wood website, and I commend it to you. One of the issues is we have, particularly in Australia, is that increasing urbanisation rates have caused what we call a disconnect with nature. Here in Australia, we've probably got the most urbanised society in the world, because such a significant majority of us live in 6 or 7 major cities. And what's actually happening is countries like China and India are catching up. There's a sort of a significant migration to major conurbations. And I say that's now what we call creating a disconnect with nature. And government research shows that we spend about 90% of our time immersed in man-made environments. Now, that may have changed slightly through the process of the pandemic, but certainly prior to that, we were either immersed at home or at work or in transit between the two. And research shows quite clearly a sort of a correlation between that and increasing levels of obesity, mental health issues, and so on. And so we really need to find ways to ameliorate that as much as we can, because obviously, we spend a lot of our time indoors. So what can we do to make buildings much more, spending time in buildings more like spending time in nature, so that they're beneficial for us? And that sort of brings us to a topic called biophilia. I suspect that when I used to talk about this years ago, I asked for audience to put their hands up, and very few would. I think that's probably changing now. It's starting to become a lot better understood. The term itself is not a particularly new one. As far as we can tell, it was first coined by a guy called Erich Fromm. He's a German-born American psychoanalyst, and he coined the term in 1964. And then it was further popularized in 1984 by a guy called Edward O. Wilson. He's an American biologist, and he wrote a book called Biophilia, and all that it entails. And it started to become much more prevalent in people's understanding, I think, since then. So, it's been around nearly as long as I have, so it's not overly new, but I think it's certainly in the last 4 or 5 years starting to become much more common in language and in design thinking and so on. And by extension, therefore, biophilic design is all about enabling a human connection to nature in the built environment in whatever way we can. And what the research shows quite conclusively is that by doing so, it actually mimics the effect of spending time in nature. And as I mentioned earlier on, just 10 minutes a day in a natural environment is extremely beneficial for us both physiologically and psychologically. Now, another name for you, another doyen of the subject, another American, Stephen R. Kellett. He's an American biologist, and he's written a couple of very authoritative books on the subject. So I certainly commend him to you if you're interested in this subject matter. And he basically outlined 6 elements of biophilic design. You don't have to satisfy all 6 to be a biophilic building, but certainly you have to satisfy at least one of them. Now, potentially at least, wood can satisfy all 6. Doesn't mean that it will do, but it certainly could do. And the first 3 of those elements that Kellett identified are environmental features. Wood provides a direct link to nature. We all recognize wood instinctively as being a natural product as compared to concrete and steel. Often in timber buildings with timber columns, you'll see people go up, they'll sort of stroke or smell or sometimes hug the column. It's not unusual. You'd never see that if there was a concrete or steel column. It just wouldn't happen. But because we have this affinity with wood and the ability, and we recognize it intuitively, people have that connection to it. Shapes and natural forms, things like grain. Again, we recognize intuitively the natural elements of that. Natural patterns and processes, the same sort of thing. And the last 3, as you can see, light and space, color diversity of timber, and it can be used in varying sizes and so on. Place-based relationships, timber coming from just down the road, for example. So again, using natural timbers that are unique to a location can have a very evocative reflection of the location. And the last one that Kellett identified is what we call evolved human-nature relationships. We recognize, we've used timber as a thing for shelter, tools, transport, art. We instinctively recognize that, and so certainly in the books that Kellett wrote, he expands on that, and as an opportunity to use timber to evoke and portray this notion of biophilic design. There's a couple of other theories that have been espoused as well. The first is what we call restoration. As you can see, it's a process of renewal that replenishes a depleted social, psychological, or physical resource. Now, the notion is, if you go out from a lovely, warm, light exterior environment into a rather dull, sort of austere, darkly lit office environment, you can become quite depressed. So the whole notion of using these buildings, and you can see the building on the right, it's from the Canberra precinct at ANU, beautiful. It's got lovely natural daylight. Obviously, the use of timber in the CLT, the indoor plants and so on. It's a much more natural environment, and it helps us to go through this, what we call this process of restoration, where we're not having to adapt to a much more sort of dull, austere interior environment. Another one is called attention restoration theory. Now, there are a lot of buildings where we need to be able to concentrate for long periods of time. Obviously, offices, schools, universities, hospitals. And again, the use of these biophilic design techniques helps us, and research shows this quite empirically, quite substantially, helps us to concentrate for longer periods of times. So again, there's a huge potential benefit to that. And I'll touch on the increased productivity that's gleaned from that later. Another one is a little bit of a tongue twister. It's called psychophysiological stress recovery theory. And essentially the theory posits that if you're surrounded by a biophilic environment, or indeed have views of nature, it can have a significant benefit from both physiological and psychological stress. And probably the best example is if people are recovering in hospital after surgery. Again, research shows quite conclusively that if they're in an environment like a biophilic designed hospital or with views of nature, their post-operative recovery time is reduced, their reliance on drugs is reduced. And of course, in the hospital setting, that's great, because then you get a faster throughput and get more people through the hospital more quickly. And of course, it's really good for the patient themselves, because they're then out of the hospital and recovering in a more natural environment. So you heard it here first, psychophysiological stress recovery theory. And again, this is alluding to quite a bit of research. The report that I mentioned earlier that we published in 2017, on the inside back cover of that report are the references that they use. And there's no less than 90 academic research papers that were referenced in the report from both Australia and around the world. So it's not kind of a marketing gimmick. It's substantiated by quite a wealth of and a growing body of research. And what the research shows quite conclusively is empirical evidence of these positive physiological effects, things like lowering of blood pressure and heart rate and so on. And that's very beneficial for all of us, particularly for school children, because school can be one of the most challenging times for some children, not all. And again, if we can use these types of environment, it can have significant and long-term benefits by reducing those impacts. Research, in fact, that was conducted by Pollinate, Howard Parry Husband's company, for FWPA back in 2018, looked at this very issue and showed quite conclusively that in an office space, if there's more timber in there, up to a point, doesn't mean you have to be saturated by timber, but up to a point, the more timber that there is in an office, the more productive people are, and also the less likely to have unplanned absenteeism, sick leave, and so on. So obviously, from a corporate benefit, there's benefits both reputationally and in terms of the productive output of their staff. Because in any office building, by far and away the biggest cost is the staff in it. It dwarfs the costs of things like heating, lighting, ventilation, maintenance, or whatever. But it is substantially the biggest cost. So of course, if buildings can be designed so that we get the maximum potential output and productivity from the people working in the building, there is a huge potential environmental and economic benefit to that. And again, the Pollinate report I commend to you. It is available for download as a PDF on the Make It Wood site. So just to conclude, where are we from time? Yeah, just about perfect, I think. Just half a dozen or so projects which articulate, I think, much more clearly than I can, some of these lovely biophilic principles. And as you can see, it's not overly new. This is a hospital that was completed in Canada, in Toronto, in 2004, so the better part of 20 years ago. But I really love the quote there. We wanted to bring the lines of nature into the built form. when people walk into the building, they feel as if they are part of something. There's a deep-rooted connection, and what they're talking about, of course, is that connection to nature. These wonderful glulam columns and indoor plants, natural daylighting, and so on. What a wonderful environment. If you have to go into hospital, I think most of us would be pretty happy if we had to go into a place like that, wouldn't we? Beautiful home environment over in WA. And again, just love the quote that came with it. The home's interiors are an ode to nature, featuring a palette of natural materials and a feng shui compliant layout. And again, beautiful timber. You've got a view of the lake in the background. For those of us that have any affiliation of timber at all, I guess from that perspective, what's not to like? And this is the first CLT school in Australia. It's Our Lady of the Assumption Catholic Primary School in North Strathfield. And again, the architect's BVN in this case. It's a very different type of space to traditional schools. We had a big focus on the use of timber and natural materials. And I can assure you it's very different to the sort of rather austere environments in the north of England that I went to in the 60s and 70s, that's for sure. Another photograph of Canberra precinct in Canberra, where there's a mass timber 450-bed accommodation building and a collaborative teaching building, both of which were built using mass timber. And again, I think this is a beautiful evocation of what the use of timber brings. Marrickville Library won the Timber Design Awards a couple of years ago. And timber is prevalent throughout the building, not just structurally, but they use timber just about wherever they possibly could. So as you can only see a couple of applications there, but I've been to the building a couple of times, and timber is front and center of this building. It really is. And as the quote from Marrickville Council says, it creates a space which is welcoming, warm, and homely. And the visitor numbers have increased substantially from the old building. So it really has become something of a hub for the Inner West Council in Marrickville. And a building that's not yet built, but they have now started to build it. Atlassian, you may well have heard about this before. When it's completed, might be 25, 26, it will at that stage be the tallest hybrid timber building in the world. And as you can see, it's beautiful. I mean, biophilic elements and these lovely gardens. Because Atlassian have said to their staff, you don't have to come to the office if you don't want. We're happy for you to work anywhere. I think they basically said the minimum number of times that we want you to come to the office is 4 times a year. Now, I'm willing to bet that's not what they actually want to happen, because they lose a lot of connectivity. Their answer to that is to develop a building like this. Now, most people, particularly of my daughter's generation, are going to want to work in a building like that. I'm absolutely confident. So they have actually started construction on the building. And as I mentioned, so it's not just timber. Timber is a big part of the structure, but it is a hybrid construction. And I think for me anyway, it's a really great example, because it's not timber or nothing. The timber working in concert with other materials like steel, glass, concrete, I think that is just as viable. Use it where it makes sense. Use it where it's applicable. And this is the last example. It's one a bit closer to home from me. It's called Maggie's Oldham, which is a cancer care facility in the west part of Manchester, about 20 miles from where I'm from. And I just love the quote. Alex de Rijke. Some of you may have maybe met Alex, but one of his famous quotes was that steel was the material of the 19th century, concrete was the material of the 20th century, and I believe that mass timber will be the material of the 21st century. That was Alex de Rijke who designed this building, and I just love the quote, so I'll read it if I may. The use of wood at Maggie's Oldham is part of a bigger design intention to reverse the norms of hospital architecture. In wood there is hope, humanity, scale, and warmth. And that, I think, really gives, articulates this far more lucidly than I ever could. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. And I must say, actually, that particular quote, there's a great TED Talk where they actually discuss that as well, looking at timber being the construction material of the 21st century. So it's a really, really inspirational thing. So, Vanda, do we have any questions from the audience?
Do we have any questions? Yep, there's one.
I had the great privilege of meeting Professor Jacqueline Kramer, who you hosted. Amazing. And in fact, we're currently working on a design for the circular economy for commercial furniture with the federal government, and we will be adopting some of Jacqueline's recommendations and working with Planet Ark in the next few months. So I'm really looking forward to that. But what I'm really wanting to know is, in terms of the recycling of timber, specifically for the purposes of where they're used in fit out or furniture, how can we make that more efficient if a lot of the product is going straight into landfill and not being waste managed?
It's a great question. I wish I knew the answer. I think part of it is designing with disassembly in mind. But of course, a lot of the built environment is already existing, so it's looking at creatively. And I guess I genuinely, I wish I knew the answer to. So I'll probably mumble some platitudes. But what can we do with it? And I'm again stating the bleeding obvious. I don't think there's a silver bullet. If there is, I'm not aware of it. But at least, thinking creatively, getting people like Jacqueline here to say, well, we've done this in Europe or the US or whatever. What potentially, at least, could that material be redeployed for at the end of the use? With apologies, I don't think I've got a better answer for you than that.
I've just got a question that's come through on the live stream. So the question is, what was the date of the National Tree Planting Day and how can we get involved?
The National Tree Day is the last weekend of July every year. Schools Tree Day is on last Friday of July. The National Tree Day is the last Sunday of July. And I'd probably recommend visiting the National Tree Day component of the Planet Ark website, and there will be information and contact details and so on. So alas, we've just missed it for this year, but it grows every year, so hopefully they'll be able to get involved next year.
So that's planetark.org.au, is that correct?
No, just .org.
.org, fantastic, fantastic.
Okay, we've got another question over here.
Was not really a question, I just wanted to answer to the discussion previously about circularity. And in my view, it comes down a lot to the manufacturer. So I know some manufacturers that include circularity in their process, and actually in relation to the building, when there is a refurbishment or an upgrade, they actually come back and take their product back to their factory and repurpose them, which could include wood elements. So I think it comes down to us to specify, I say us because I'm an architect, but specify products that have that into consideration and make sure that the plan is followed by the building owner, and then make sure that much more manufacturer takes that into consideration and think about taking back their product instead of having them going to landfill and then repurpose them. I don't know, I've got many examples in mind, but I'm sure everyone knows them.
Brilliant, thank you for that.
Oh yes, just going to add to that a bit. Students aren't at the moment probably educated about. I work in the furniture industry, and personally, when I was a furniture maker, I would salvage timber, use recycled timber, get stuff from building skips, denail it, use veneers because veneers and press veneers, absolutely. Use every single scrap of it, but in the education system there isn't that education element that's happening, and it needs to happen across the board because there's a big gap in that education element.
Sure.
Yeah.
And that's certainly part of what the ACE Hub, it's really, as the name implies, it's a hub and a repository for information and so on. So bringing like-minded people together, and certainly the educational component of that is a very significant one. The ACE Hub was only formally launched in November two years ago, so it's still in its relative infancy. And there's always a big steep learning curve for for all of us, I think. But certainly getting students on board in terms of those thinking processes is a critical opportunity, I think.
Just another question from the live stream. So, David, is there a risk with so much timber being imported that we may become complacent with certification? Possibly.
You're probably in a better position to answer that than I am, Jason, to be honest. But yes, I think it is a risk. One of the things I've written about previously is sometimes if people let's look here, for example, in Victoria and WA, saying after 2030 there will be no native harvesting whatsoever. Well, I think sometimes you've got to be careful what you wish for, because the demand for timber ain't going to stop. We love timber in our homes, we love timber furniture and so on. So if it's not coming from native forests in Victoria or from WA, in those particular two examples, then inevitably it will come from somewhere else. And if that somewhere else is in, let's say, Southeast Asia, for example, where procedures and policies are not quite so advanced, and I'm trying to put this as politely as I can.
We are on the live stream, really.
Then there is undoubtedly a risk that the materials that are coming, not all of them, but undoubtedly some of it will be coming from areas where the practices and processes are far less rigorous than they are in Australia. So you've got to be careful what you wish for.
Very well answered.
My question is regarding plantation area we are utilizing, only 1.5% or something. So why we are not thinking of increasing that so that we can increase the plantation production? Maybe even reducing the natural forest. I'm not saying that that's the right path, but looking at the demand and population growth, is it something which we should be looking in the longer term?
I think Tim largely answered this before. It's a complex issue because it's all about land use, and obviously we need to have plantations in appropriate area where there's appropriate rainfall and so on. The 1.5% figure is the percentage of total forest is plantation, roughly. And yes, it would be highly desirable. There's obviously the Million Trees programme, and AFPA is certainly advocating for an additional 400,000 hectares of plantation. We would certainly agree with that. But, we've got to find the land from somewhere, and we've got to make sure that it's economically viable. And nowhere in the world has plantation estate grown without appropriate government intervention and policy frameworks and so on. So that certainly has a part to play. It is a complex issue, but undoubtedly, we need more, because it's not either or. And it's a bit like timber can be used in concert with concrete, steel, glass, whatever. So we can get timber from both native forest, which by and large satisfies one requirement, and plantation, which for the most part is where our framing comes from. So yes, we need to get more, but it is a complex issue, I think, unfortunately.
Look, I just your point about before in relation to the research being done. Is it going to be beneficial psychologically and stuff? I don't even understand why a cent's been put into this, because to me it's obvious that it's going to be an improvement. I mean, you look at people in office spaces, would they prefer to sit at a desk looking at a wall or out a window at a roof garden? Mm. And I raised this 15 years ago that we need more green space on buildings. And people were saying, Chris, we need to actually get some research and some data on this, because, I don't think that's right. And I think, what, you're going to tell me that someone's going to enjoy sitting with a reflective metal roof in a work environment, or whether it's your home, and you're not going to appreciate more a green space? So, look, sorry, just a comment more than anything. I just think that, when they're investing money, they need to invest in proper stuff, because to me, that's a no-brainer.
Sure.
Thanks, David, as always. Brilliant presentation. I suppose a discussion point around the supply of timber, and particularly the supply of hardwoods, not so much softwoods, but is the sort of growing space of agroforestry. Obviously, as we're seeing, our native forests being locked up, which obviously there's a lot of politics involved with that. There is this growing space where agricultural producers are being more involved from a forestry side, planting stands of trees which they can obviously harvest when they need some cash flow, but also providing benefits for their water tables, for their stock, for their other plants. So just an interesting thing to put out there. I don't think it gets enough airtime. It is something which is still very small, but it is growing. Obviously a great way for us to get our good,
Yeah.
very sustainable hardwoods.
No, I agree. Research shows that up to, I think it's about 20% of land cover in forestry can actually be extremely beneficial, as you mentioned, for livestock and for water control, wind. There are some significant benefits that farmers can realise, and from what little bit you'd be better versed in it than I am, I suspect. But it's of the order of 20% of land cover is an effective percentage, and yeah, I think it would be great if we can start to see that type of application grow for sure.
I've got one final question from the live stream, so apologies, but my eyes are playing up on me, and it's quite a long question, so be patient. David, thanks for some true facts regarding the real current extent and impact of sustainable renewable Australian native production forest harvesting, which is regularly maligned, around 0.1% per year, all regrown, a minuscule error and all regrown by law. The biggest issues for public native forests is wildfire, pests, feral animals, urbanisation, not hardwood timber production. Users need to ask for certified timber. Would you like to expand on this for users?
I'd probably just agree, basically. Given time constraints, it is exactly 3:30 and we're between the finishing cocktails.
The question was the journey.
Indeed. Difficult to disagree.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, David. So that, by and large, concludes the presentations for today. Would you please join me with an applause and thanking our fabulous 5 presenters today. To Jorge, David, Boris, Tim and David Rowlinson, your presentations were fantastic.
Thank you.